Teacher here. Today we're going to be reading Women in Space, Part 1. In 1959, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, introduced the first 7 United States astronauts to the public. The announcement was made with great fanfare. It brought instant acclaim to the 7. All had previously been test pilots, and all were male. Less than 2 decades later, things had changed tremendously. In 1978, another new contingent of aspiring astronauts arrived for training at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. On this occasion, they included scientists, engineers, and medical doctors. In addition, 6 of the 35 fledgling astronauts were women. So we're talking about women in space, right? When NASA first came about, all of the astronauts were men. But less than 20 years later, right, things had started changing and some new astronauts came for training. 6 of those 35 were women. At first, a condescending attitude toward women in the space program by some of the older men presented a rather troublesome problem. These space veterans felt that women lacked the right stuff to be astronauts. To dispel such prejudices, the women recognized the fact that they needed to perform as well as, or better than, their male counterparts. Candidates had to be smart, tough, and highly educated, and had to be extraordinarily meticulous in everything they did. Physical strength, the one area where the men could often outperform the women, was not an important factor. During their year of basic training, the 6 women met the challenge. They proved their mettle in all essential situations. So, especially from some of the older men at NASA, they were prejudiced towards women in their field. They thought women didn't have what it takes. They didn't think they were able to keep up with the men in the program. They needed a lot of things. To be astronauts, you have to be smart, tough, highly educated, but especially the women, because they were proving themselves to the men there, unfortunately, which they had to do. They had to be better, or at least as good as all their male counterparts. Thankfully, in space, muscles and strength is not a big thing. You really don't need it in space because of gravity or the lack of gravity. So they didn't need that. But during basic training, all 6 women were able to prove that they were just as good, if not better, than the male astronauts. Training to be an astronaut was a daunting task. The astronauts studied a range of subjects: astronomy, meteorology, geology, mathematics, navigation, and human anatomy. They spent hundreds of hours in the classroom learning the inner workings of every component of the space shuttle. Then they received hands-on experience in a replica of the space shuttle. The model was complete in even the smallest detail. Therefore, the actual space shuttle was comfortingly familiar to the astronauts, even when they went aboard for the first time. So, to be an astronaut, the training is a lot. You have to learn about all these different subjects. You have to spend hundreds of hours learning about every single piece of the space shuttle. Right? When you're in space, no one can fix something for you, so you have to know how to do everything in that spaceship. And luckily, they were able to train in a replica of the space shuttle. So it looked exactly like the space shuttle they would be in. So finally, when they were on the real space shuttle, they wouldn't have been nervous or uncomfortable with their surroundings because they had trained in the same surroundings. Trainee astronauts spent time underwater to simulate the effects of weightlessness they would experience in space. They also endured flights aboard K-135 planes, which flew almost vertically upward before turning back along a protracted flight path that curved toward the Earth. This produced a sensation of weightlessness. These flights also gave other sensations, which led to the nauseated trainees dubbing the aircraft the Vomit Comet. So during their training, they would do exercises in water to experience weightlessness in their body. And they would also go on these K-135 planes. They had this cutesy pet name for them, the Vomit Comet, because it would go straight up and then curve back toward the Earth, giving you weightlessness, but it was a very quick sensation. So, called the vomit comet, we can assume that it caused a lot of people to feel nauseous and maybe to throw up on the plane. A critically important component of the program was survival training, both on land and at sea. What if the space shuttle's rocket engines and their backup systems failed while it was in orbit? The chance of this happening was negligible. Still, the astronauts had to be prepared for every remote possibility. They practiced climbing inside fabric rescue balls that were 30 inches in diameter and could be rapidly inflated with oxygen. In an emergency, an astronaut would sit inside a ball waiting to be transferred to a rescue vehicle. Climbing into one of these was very unpleasant, especially for an individual suffering from a mild form of claustrophobia. Fortunately, it was decided that the ball was not a good solution and never flew on any shuttles. So they had to learn how to survive in case emergency things happened, right? In land and on the sea, and even in space. There was this tiny chance of if their rocket or engines had failed while in space. So they had this idea of these 30-inch rescue balls where one would climb in and it would be inflated with oxygen. But 30 inches is not very big. So if you were claustrophobic or afraid of small spaces, it would be very unpleasant. Luckily, they never ended up using these. Finally, in the spring of 1982, one of the 6 women graduates of the space program was chosen for Space Transportation System 7. She was Sally Ride, a scientist with an advanced degree in physics from Stanford University. Her areas of expertise were X-ray astronomy and lasers. As soon as the announcement was made, NASA was deluged with requests for interviews with the first American woman to venture into space. Dr. Ride cheerfully submitted to endless questions from reporters. She answered even the most inane questions with patience and good humor. So one of these graduates was chosen for a space mission. She was the first American woman who was to go into space. So she was very, very smart, and many people wanted interviews with her. And she was asked big questions and even very inane, small questions, right? She was famous now, so everyone wanted to know everything they could about her. After the flood of publicity came a further year of intensive training geared to the specific requirements of the mission for which she had been chosen. Then, on June 18, 1983, along with 4 male colleagues, Dr. Sally Ride began her historic 5-day flight aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. So, Dr. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, she did more training and got to go to this 5-day flight on the Challenger, a very, very famous space mission. But we won't talk about that today. Thank you for reading with me. We do have links that are related to each article here. If you want the links for this one, you can find it down in the description below.